Is the EU about to attempt to plunder Ireland's tax revenues? Over the last decade or two, Ireland has done incredibly well. From where they were to where they are is a model of enterprise and initiative. They were very wise to introduce a very low rate of 12.5% for offshore companies, which drew in some of the largest companies in the world to base themselves in Ireland, bringing the country much needed tax revenue literally for hosting them and not providing anything in return. However, there is always a price for everything, because when you have large offshore corporations that can make such a large presence in such a small population and overall economy, it can actually distort the figures. If you were to look up the GDP figures for Ireland, they are incredible, and the GDP per capita is one of the highest in the world, with the exception of some of the anomalies such as Monaco and places like that. But all is not as it seems, because as I've said before, there are lies, damn lies and statistics, and there is no greater fiscal lie than GDP, because within the GDP figures is also included government borrowing. What they borrow to invest in a country is included in their GDP figures. In Ireland's case, where they have these offshore corporations, then their turnover is included in the GDP of Ireland, and when it is divided up to the GDP per capita, from the outside looking in, you would think that the average citizen of the Republic of Ireland has the lifestyle similar to a citizen of Kuwait, but nothing could be further from the truth, because what's actually happened is these offshore corporations have skewed the figures. They've created a bubble, and they are an entity in their own right. They function within themselves. They have their own team of skilled workers that they ship in. They affect the local housing, and as many of you may remember the scenes of a property for rent in Dublin a few months ago, where there was a queue that went all the way down the street and round the corner. So life for the average citizen has become harder still, but it may be about to get even harder, because the EU is now looking at the Irish coffers with greed. Now, despite the narrative, the EU is struggling to fund itself, and that has been seriously exacerbated since the EU left. They needed, or they badly miss, our contribution. And not only that, their relative position on the world stage is shrinking at an alarming rate. Just as recently as 2018, with the UK, the EU represented 22% of global GDP. Without the UK last year, it was 16.5%, and this year it has fallen to around 15%, and with Germany plunging into recession, that is being revised downwards to below 15%. They're on target to represent no more than 10% or less than 10% of global GDP by the end of the decade. Hence the reasons that there are, once again, calls for the EU to expand so that they can bring in more countries and plunder their wealth one way or another, directly or indirectly. But as far as Ireland is concerned, firstly, they are pressuring Ireland to increase its corporate tax rate to the 15%, which is a figure that has been internationally agreed, so that no country would be able to have the advantage over another. Now, I'm not saying that this is how I see things, but if we look around, there is one empirical fact that rears its head again and again and again. Rules are often created by rule makers to ensure that they maintain their advantageous position and simultaneously to prevent those who they do have the advantage over from being able to change the odds, which is why sometimes people who are in a position of legal disadvantage resort to acting outside the law. I'll let that sink in. Now, Ireland should, I believe, be allowed to decide its own tax rates for offshore companies. Ireland, after suffering not just for decades but for centuries, now that it has begun to make such giant step forwards economically, and as I said, there is still a long way to go because they need to find a way to ensure that wealth trickles down to everyday citizens. But these are decisions to be made internally by the government of the Republic of Ireland, not something for the EU or the IMF or anyone else to interfere with. But there's also another threat on the horizon. The EU is actually behind closed doors considering to impose a 0.5% levy on the revenue from offshore companies that is being brought in to Ireland. As far as I'm concerned, that is little more than theft. It is another example of the arrogance, autocracy and unaccountability of the horrid, infernal failed experiment that is the EU. And I do hope that they leave Ireland alone, because Ireland has come so far and it still has a long way to go if it is going to ensure that everyday citizens do not suffer because they have been locked out of housing or left behind by the wealthier offshore element. But they are going in the right direction, and it is not for the EU or anyone else to interfere in their internal economy. As for the UK, that to me is clear evidence to support why we should not only have left the EU when we did, but we should have left more abruptly, and we should not have been tearing our own economy apart by allowing ourselves to be undermined by those who dislike their own country so much that they would rather that these dishonest con artists dictate to us rather than our own homegrown con artists. Anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye for now.